This video was sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can pre-order all the cards in this video by using the link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neatsahone, and today I'm continuing with my limited set review for Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth. So far I've looked at all the multicolored, colorless white and blue cards, and today we're continuing with black. For each of these cards I'll discuss how I think they'll play in Limited, and I'll sum up my thoughts by using a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews, you can find out exactly what those grades mean in the description. A couple of things to keep in mind as we look at these cards. I'm only evaluating them for play in Limited and not other formats. These are my evaluations of these cards before actually playing with them, so I of course won't be right about everything, though I will be providing updates about the format as I play it. Additionally, only cards that appear in draft boosters will be reviewed in this series. Lastly, I want to let you know that I'm offering some set review related perks for both patrons and channel members. You get access to my ongoing notes during preview season, and by the end of the set review, you'll have a spreadsheet with all of my grades. If those perks sound interesting to you and you want to support the channel, you can find ways to become a channel member or a patron in the description. Alright, let's dive in with a look at our first black card from Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth. First, there's Bitter Downfall, which for 3 generic and a red is an uncommon instant. It costs 3 less to cast if it targets a creature that was dealt damage this turn, and it says destroy target creature, its controller loses 2 life. If this always cost 4 mana, it would be a good removal spell, so the upside of destroying a damaged creature for a lot less mana is nice. That said, that mode is sort of the secondary one. Removal spells that can only destroy things that have been damaged don't tend to be very good. And so if you end up using it that way, it is going to give you less value a lot of the time because you end up having to use up some resource to damage that creature in the first place. Still, having that additional option is great because the base card is already a premium removal spell. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's the Black Breath, which for 2 generic and a black is a common sorcery. Creatures your opponents control get -1/-1 until end of turn. The ring tempts you. So when you get tempted by the ring, you get an emblem called the ring, if it's the first time the ring has tempted you, and you choose a ring bearer. Your ring bearer gets each bonus that you've unlocked on the ring, and you unlock another bonus on the ring every time the ring tempts you. You can choose a new ring bearer every time the ring tempts you, but you can only have 1 at a time. So this is a one-sided -1/-1 effect that can be good in the right matchup, but mostly I think that means this needs a sideboard grade. If you're not able to take down creatures with this consistently, it's just not going to be worth it. As the ring tempts you alone isn't going to be enough for the cost. This is a D if you played in your main deck and a C out of your sideboard. Next up, it's Call of the Ring, which for 1 generic and a black is a rare enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, the ring tempts you. Whenever you choose a creature as your ring bearer, you can pay 2 life, and if you do, draw a card. Getting tempted by the ring repeatedly does generate some pretty real value, and this gives you the ability to also draw some additional cards, in addition to giving a creature an upgrade. Keep in mind you can keep choosing different ring bearers if you want to, and the effect from Tempted by the Ring, and when you have this around, you're going to want to switch your ring bearers so that you also have the option to draw cards. This has potential to generate some serious value, but it doesn't do a whole lot the turn it comes down, and if you can't keep a creature around, it's going to feel pretty bad. Still, I think it's pretty good overall. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Serithungle Patrol, which for 4 generic and a black is a 4/5 orc soldier at common. You can pay 1 generic and tap it and sacrifice another creature, draw a card, and then create a food token. This is a more powerful sacrifice effect than we usually see on, a random black common. There's one like this in every set that lets you sacrifice another creature to draw a card. But this one also gives you a food token, and that's some pretty real value. If you're a grind to your deck, drawing cards and gaining life is one of the best ways to stabilize against aggressive opponents, and this can really let you do that. It also has semi-decent stats, and there's plenty of good sacrifice fodder in the set, so I think this looks like a pretty good common. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Claim the Precious. For 1 generic and 2 black, it's a common sorcery. Destroy target creature, the ring tempts you. This is murder, except it got downgraded to sorcery, and you get tempted by the ring in exchange. Either way, this is definitely premium removal, as it can deal with almost anything efficiently while giving you a nice bonus. It does cost double black, and that does actually matter on premium removal, because you often want to splash premium removal when your fixing is good enough, and you can't do that here. Still, it's a good card. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Dunland Krabane, which for 2 generic and a black is a 1/1 bird horror. At common, it's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you amass orcs too. This looks like a nice common, a 3-mana 1/1 flyer that also gives you a 2/2, or alternatively, puts 2 counters on a creature you already control, is a good rate. You're getting 3 worth of stats for 3 mana, some of it as flying. This looks like a very good black common. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Easterling Vanguard, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/1 human warrior at common, and when it dies, you amass Orcs 1. You get 3/2 worth of stats for 2 mana here, and sure, you don't get it all at the same time, but this still looks like a solid 2-drop, and it's decent sacrifice fodder, and that is, of course, a theme in black. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Gollum Patient Plotter, which for 1 generic and a black is a 3/1 legendary halfling horror at uncommon. When it leaves the battlefield, the ring tempts you, and you can pay 1 black and sacrifice a creature to return Gollum from your graveyard to your hand, activate only as a sorcery. A 2-mana 3/1 is usually borderline playable, even with nothing else going on, and Gollum definitely has some other stuff going on. Getting tempted by the ring is a nice effect, and you can keep bringing Gollum back. Bringing him back won't really be worth it unless you have some sacrifice fodder lying around, but that's not a huge ask. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Golems Bite, which for 1 black mana is an uncommon instant. It says target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn, and you can pay 3 generic and a black to exile it from your graveyard and the ring tempts you. Activate only as a sorcery. A 1 mana instant that gives -2/-2 to a creature is already premium removal. You can trade up with it super easily, so the fact you can also get the ring to tempt you from the graveyard later on the game is nice upside to have on an already very good card. Giving this a B. Next up, it's Gorbag of Menace Morgul, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 legendary orc soldier at uncommon. Whenever a goblin or orc you control deals combat damage to a player, you may sacrifice it. When you do, choose one, draw a card, or create a treasure token. This has decent base stats and a useful creature type, and the ability isn't bad either. You aren't always going to be in a spot where you want to sacrifice a goblin or an orc for these effects, but there are definitely times where you'd be happy to turn a creature into a card or a treasure. It does also count itself, so keep that in mind. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Gothmog Morgul Lieutenant, which for 3 generic and a black is a 3/3 legendary human soldier at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you amass Orcs 1, and creature tokens you control have Death Touch. So if you don't already have an orc army, this is 4 mana for a 3/3 and a 1/1 with Death Touch. And if you do have one, this is 4 mana for a 3/3 and a +1/+1 counter and Death Touch on the army you already have. No matter which thing happens, that's a very, very good rate. Keep in mind he works with other tokens too. You know, army is the one that it's going to work with the most often since he amasses. But you might also have some 1/1 humans that are also going to have Death Touch. So it's an upgrade that matters for more than just your armies. Giving this a B. Next up, it's Grima Wormtongue, which for 2 generic and a black is a 1/4 legendary human advisor at uncommon. Your opponents can't gain life. You can tap it and sacrifice another creature. Target player loses 1 life. If the sacrificed creature was legendary, amass Orcs 2. Shutting off life gain isn't that big of a deal in Limited, but the rest of the card seems reasonable. It has passable defensive stats, and an ability that can be great if you have sacrifice fodder. One awkward thing about it is that you aren't usually going to be interested in actually sacrificing a legendary creature to the effect, because most of your legendary creatures are going to be better than amass Orcs 2. Still, he's a reasonable sacrifice outlet with decent stats. I think he's a C. Next up, it's Grond the Gatebreaker, which for 3 generic and a black is a 5/5 legendary artifact vehicle at uncommon. It's got trample. As long as it's your turn and you control an army, Grond the Gatebreaker is an artifact creature, and it has Crew 3. If your deck's not good at making an army, this is not good. Crew 3 is higher than you would want to pay for this creature. Additionally, even if you do have an army, the upside here, the absolute ceiling, is you get a 4 mana 5/5 trampler that's only active on your turn. You still have to crew it on your opponent's turn. So the ceiling's not insane. And if you don't have an army around, it's kind of a liability because of how hard it can be to crew 3. So I think it's probably just a C. Next up, it's Haunt of the Dead Marshes, which for 1 black mana is a 1/1 Nightmare Elf at common. When it enters the battlefield, you scry 1. You can pay 2 generic and a black to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Activate only if you control a legendary creature. We've already seen several cards that want things to sacrifice, and Haunt of the Dead Marshes is definitely one of those. Having a legendary creature isn't a guarantee in the format, but it is way easier than normal because there's lots of legendaries at uncommon, and the Ring Tempts You also makes any one of your creatures into a legendary creature. I like that you get to scry 1 every time this comes back too. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Isildur's Fateful Strike, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a rare legendary instant, and that means you can only cast it if you control a legendary creature or planeswalker. Destroy target creature. If its controller has more than 4 cards in hand, they exile cards from their hand equal to the difference. Again, this set has lots of legendaries in it, but last time we saw legendary spells that was true, and it still wasn't anywhere close to automatic that you could cast them. Most of those from original Dominaria, with the exception of the green one I guess, were really powerful spells when you could cast them, and I actually think Isildur's Fateful Strike falls a little short of that. Obviously, if this didn't have that hoop to jump through, it would be an amazing removal spell, but the main thing about it that keeps it from being insane is that there aren't going to be that many times when you cast this in Limited that you actually affect your opponent's hand at all. Even if you cast this on turn 4, there's a very real chance that that part of the card doesn't matter, so what we're talking about mostly is a 4-mana instant that destroys a creature, and one that makes you jump through a fairly large hoop to cast it in the first place. The times when your opponent does have cards in their hand, more than 4, so 5, 6, or 7 cards in their hand, it is going to feel insane, but don't count on it happening that much. I think overall, that makes this a C+. Obviously, again, if you could cast it whenever you wanted, it would probably be a B+, because that upside would be good enough, in addition to just being a premium removal spell. But again, having to have a legendary creature, I think keeps this from being premium. Next up, it's Lash of the Balrog, which for 1 black mana is a common sorcery. As an additional cost to cast it, sacrifice a creature or pay 4 generic, destroy target creature. Well, this is another nice removal spell for black. This is Bone Splinters, when that's what you need, but having the option of paying 5 to kill something with it is nice too, since it means in the later stages of the game when you have a bunch of mana and you don't really want to give up a creature, you can just cast this as a clunky removal spell. Neither of those modes is amazing. Individually, each of those cards is like a C, but the modality, plus the presence of good sacrifice fodder in the format, makes this a C+. Next up, it's Lobelia Baggins, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/3 legendary halfling citizen at rare. She's got Flash and Menace, and when she enters the battlefield, exile target creature card from an opponent's graveyard that was put there from the battlefield this turn, then create X treasure tokens, where X is the exiled card's power. A 3-mana 2/3 with Flash and Menace is already a solid card. It has the right kind of size to come down and ambush block a decent number of creatures, and Menace means that it can also come out of nowhere and represent 2 more damage your opponent didn't account for. So it's pretty great that it can also exile a creature from a graveyard and generate a bunch of treasure. You won't always have a target for the effect, especially because it is so timing restricted. But when you do, the ramp you can get out of Lobelia is going to be pretty serious. Like if you're doing it in the early game especially, like you traded your 2-drop for their 2-drop and then you cast Lobelia, that's going to be a huge turn. So the ceiling here is pretty impressive, and the floor is fine, so I think overall she's a B. Next up, it's March from the Black Gate, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon enchantment. When it enters a battlefield, and whenever an army you control attacks, amass Orcs 1. So, if you don't already have an army, this gives you a 1 mana 1/1 right away. If you do already have one, I think that's going to be the most attractive mode with this, because it means you'll put a counter on that army, and then you can attack with it that same turn, and it gets another counter. So, that +2/+2 will make a big difference if you already have an army. And if you don't, generating a 1/1 isn't too bad. Especially because it will just keep getting larger every turn because you're going to keep amassing. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Mechwood Bats, which for 3 generic and a black is a 2/3 creature bat. At common, it's got flying. And whenever you create or sacrifice a token, each opponent loses 1 life. This stat line is well below rate these days, but this ability has the potential to be really strong, especially with food and treasure tokens around, because those are tokens you create that also have sacrifice built into their functionality. So each of those will make your opponent lose 2 life, in other words. And obviously it works with other tokens too, including armies, including the human tokens in the format, and so forth. This is a really interesting card because I think the ability is surprisingly powerful for a common, but the stat line is enough of a liability that I don't think it's amazing. But it is the kind of card that I could see end up being way better because it does have this really high ceiling. For now, though, I'm going to give it a C+. Next up, it's Mordor Muster, which for 1 generic and a black is a common sorcery. You draw a card and you lose 1 life, amass Orcs 1. We've seen a lot of 2-mana 1/1s that draw you a card when they enter the battlefield and Limited over the years, and that's kind of what the baseline is here. And they're always pretty good. The format also has a bunch of extra amass and Orc synergy, so you can get some extra value out of this 1/1 that you can't always get out of those 2-mana 1/1s we've seen in the past, giving this a C+. Next up, it's Mordor Trebuchet, which for 2 generic and a black is a 1/4 artifact creature wall. At common, it's got Defender. Whenever you attack with 1 or more goblins and or orcs, create a 2/1 colorless construct artifact creature token with flying named Ballistic Boulder that's tapped and attacking. Sacrifice that token at end of combat. Obviously, you're going to be happiest with this in a black-red deck. That's the deck that's most about goblins and orcs. And in that deck, this seems like a pretty legit payoff. A 3-mana 1/4 isn't anything to write home about, especially one that can't attack, but throwing a 2/1 flying boulder at your opponent every time you attack with a goblin or orc is pretty sweet. Sometimes your opponent will just be able to block it and not care, but if you have sacrifice outlets around, you can also get some extra value out of the boulder. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Morgul Knife Wound, which for 1 generic and a black is a common enchantment aura with enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets -3/-0 and has, at the beginning of your upkeep, exile this creature unless you pay 2 life. I don't think this is good, and that's okay because black, as we've already seen, has a bunch of good removal spells. I think this is one that'll trick people into thinking it's a cheap, efficient removal spell, but it has some very serious problems. It's basically a black version of the kind of removal spell blue usually gets that makes a creature into a 0/2 or whatever, and those are always pretty underwhelming. So let's go through this card's problems. The biggest thing is that it doesn't entirely remove a creature on its own. That effectively means you're going down a card and not taking a full card from your opponent. In fact, you're not even getting close. You're just lowering its power. It can still block, perhaps even really effectively since its toughness is unaffected. It can still use all of its abilities. It still has all of its static abilities. And if it had high enough power to begin with, it might still be a problematic attacker and blocker. All of that is very, very bad news. Additionally, giving your opponent an option about whether to pay life or exile this is way worse than it looks because your opponent can always choose whichever option. Doesn't really matter, and most of the time, neither of them will. Basically, even when this does operate as removal, it isn't going to give you a full card of value, and there will be plenty of times where it is far worse than that. It doesn't even get a blocker out of the way. It just doesn't do anything you need a removal spell to actually do. Don't let this card trick you because I think it's an F. Next up, it's Nasty End, which for 1 generic and a black is a common instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature, draw 2 cards. If the sacrificed creature was legendary, draw 3 cards instead. This type of spell is never amazing, but it does often find a deck. If you have a legendary creature that's worth sacrificing, this can feel particularly good, but the problem with this kind of card is always that you don't have something worth giving up all the time. There is sacrifice fodder in the format that makes this good enough, I think. You can, of course, also use it in response to removal, which can be quite impressive, but, don't count on that too much. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Nasgul, which for 2 generic and a black is an uncommon Wraith Knight. It's a 1/2, it's got Death Touch. When it enters the battlefield, the ring tempts you, and whenever the ring tempts you, put a +1/+1 counter on each Wraith you control. A deck can have up to 9 cards named Nasgul. This is effectively a 3-mana 2/3 with Death Touch, and because the ring tempts you, you're also going to have the option of giving it or something else some additional abilities. They're uncommon, so you're never going to get like a million of them. And it's funny, the whole you can have up to 9 cards named Nasgul. The funny thing is in Limited, there's no limit on how many copies of a card you can play, provided that you've drafted them. So theoretically, that would mean you could play 10 Nazguls in Limited if you had them, which would obviously be insane, but it's not going to happen. They're uncommon. But, as an individual card, I think this is pretty good. Delivers a lot of value, and if you're good at having the ring tempt you, it's just going to keep getting bigger. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Oath of the Grey Host, which for 3 generic and a black is an uncommon enchantment saga. Chapter 1 says you and target opponent each create a food token. Chapter 2 says each opponent loses 3 life, create a treasure token. And Chapter 3 says create 3 tapped 1/1 white spirit creature tokens with flying. This is an interesting saga. I don't love giving my opponent a food token, but the end result of this card seems efficient. You get 3 1/1 flyers, a treasure token, and your opponent loses 3 life, and you get a food, though that part is kind of a wash because your opponent got one too. So it's kind of slow, but each chapter does deliver real value, and getting those 1/1s at the end is going to feel good. They do enter tapped, which makes this a lot clunkier than it would otherwise be. If you got to have them enter untapped, this would feel a lot like a Kamigawa Neon Dynasty saga that transforms into a creature. And it still kind of gives you that same sort of value, but the fact that they enter tapped is a big problem in some situations. Still, I think this looks pretty good overall. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's One Ring to Rule Them All, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a rare enchantment saga. Chapter 1 says the ring tempts you, then each player mills cards equal to your ring bearer's power. Chapter 2 says destroy all non-legendary creatures. And Chapter 3 says each opponent loses 1 life for each creature card in that player's graveyard. So, because a ring bearer is legendary, the idea here is that Chapter 2 will hurt you less than it hurts your opponent. And for the most part, I think that's true. The downside is that there are lots of legendary creatures in the set that your opponent could have. Your opponent could have a ring bearer too, and that is going to be kind of annoying. Still, because of Chapter 1, this will usually hurt you less than your opponent, and Chapter 3 also makes sure that your opponent will get hurt more by this saga than you do. Your opponent is likely to have several creatures in the graveyard between Chapters 1 and 2. Still, the fact that this will sometimes not kill multiple creatures your opponent has is a problem. Sometimes it'll hurt you more than it hurts your opponent, and I don't love that either. I think this is a B. Next up, it's Orcish Bowmasters, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/1 Orc Archer. At rare, it's got Flash. When it enters the battlefield and whenever an opponent draws a card except the first one they draw in each of their draw steps, Orcish Bowmasters deals 1 damage to any target, then amass Orcs 1. A 2-mana 1/1 with Flash that pings something and amasses 1 is a pretty awesome rate. You won't often be able to trigger this multiple times in the game, but the blue-white deck in the format is interested in drawing extra cards, and this does punish them significantly if they're doing that. But even if that never happens, the base rate on this card is really impressive. You can potentially generate a 3-for-1 in an ideal scenario. Most of the time, you're probably not going to get there because you have 3 things that do 1 damage, and it's not like your opponent's going to have a bunch of X1s. But still, this gives you a lot of value for the cost. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Orcish Medicine, which for 1 generic and a black is a common instant. Target creature gains your choice of lifelink or indestructible until end of turn, amass Orcs 1. This trick is not very likely to help your creature win combat. It does blink an attack, or gain you life at worst, and the fact it blinks removal isn't too bad either. You add Amass to the mix, and I think you have a card that makes the cut in your black deck sometimes, but for a trick to really be worthwhile, it does need to be more useful in combat than this is. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Sam's Desperate Rescue, which for 1 black mana is a common sorcery. Return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. The ring tempts you. 1 mana to return a creature from your graveyard to your hand is okay, though. Honestly, I'd usually rather pay 3 mana to get 2 things back, as that gives you a more significant advantage in the late game. That said, paying 1 will often mean you can play the thing you get back right away, and getting tempted by the ring even makes this have a decent fail case if you don't have something in the graveyard. And this is another cheap spell that does 2 things for 1 mana, so it could end up overperforming, but overall, I think both of these effects are kind of underpowered, so I think the grand total is a C. Next up, it's Sauron the Necromancer, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 4/4 legendary avatar horror. At rare, it's got Menace. When it attacks, exile target creature card from your graveyard, create a tapped and attacking token that's a copy of that card, except it's a 3/3 black wraith with Menace. At the beginning of the next end step, exile that token unless Sauron is your ring bearer. A 5-mana 4/4 with Menace is passable, and generating a temporary 3/3 attacking Menace token is pretty nice. If you can make Sauron into the ring bearer, this effect becomes truly insane, since that token will stick around. You do need to have a creature card in your graveyard, and that's not just going to be automatic. If you're in black, there's a pretty good chance you've got something to get back, and the fact that you make the thing into a 3/3 attacking creature with Menace means it's always going to be worthwhile to bring it back. The bad news here is that it isn't exactly impossible to take Sauron down in combat, and if you're only getting a temporary token out of the deal, it's not going to feel like great value. Though if you get something back with an enter the battlefield ability or something like that, it's pretty good. If you can back them up with removal, that's also really good. That's always really good with Menace. I do think this sneaks into the lower bomb range. You know, even if you don't ever make him into the ring bearer, this seems pretty strong. And if you do, it seems completely insane. Giving it an A-. Next up, it's Shadow of the Enemy, which for 3 generic and 3 black is a mythic rare sorcery. Exile all creature cards from target player's graveyard. You may cast spells from among those cards for as long as they remain exiled, and mana of any type can be spent to cast them. So this can give you a ton of cards, but it's also a really expensive, hard to cast sorcery that will usually not do anything the turn you cast it, and that is a huge liability. So you need things to line up with your opponent having enough cards in their graveyard. You need your mana to line up correctly, and you need to survive after casting this thing that doesn't impact the board at all. Obviously, if it's the really late game and you get to untap, this can win you the game, but it seems so bad in so many other situations that I think most of the time you're just not supposed to play this. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Shelobs Ambush, which for 1 black mana is a common instant. Target creature gets +1/+2 and gains Death Touch until end of turn. Create a food token. Now this is a nice trick. 1 mana tricks are always really nice, largely because they're incredibly cheap. And that's especially true when the trick goes a long way towards helping your creature win and survive combat. +1/+2 and Death Touch at least guarantees your opponent's creature is going to die, but the toughness boost coupled with that usually also means your creature will survive. And then you get a food token on top of that. This seems like an amazing 1-mana trick for black aggro decks. It is still a trick, so when I say a trick's amazing, that means it's like a C+. That's kind of the ceiling on tricks because they are situational enough. But I can see myself playing 2 or 3 of these in aggressive black decks. Next up, it's Snarling Warg, which for 3 generic and a black is a 3/4 Menace at common. And as long as you control a goblin or orc, it gets +1/+0. A 4-mana 3/4 with Menace is an okay stat line, and this will be a 4/4 a decent chunk of the time, especially in black-red, giving it a C. Next up, it's the Torment of Gollum, which for 3 generic and a black is a common sorcery. Target opponent reveals their hand, you choose a non-land card from it, that player discards that card, amass orcs 2. So the last time we saw Amass, there was an Amass discard spell that really overperformed. It only amassed 1, and it cost 1 less mana, so the cards aren't identical, but I'm reasonably confident in saying that this is going to be a pretty nice common. This nets you a 2-for-1 in lots of situations. Just imagine that this is a 4-mana 2/2 that lets you go after your opponent's hand, because that's basically what it is. It does feel a little less good when you just put 2 counters on an army you already have, but that's still not a bad deal. I'm giving it a C+. Next, it's Troll of Kaza Doom, which for 5 generic and a black is a 6/5 troll at common. Can't be blocked by 3 or more creatures, and it has swamp cycling for 1 generic. This means you can pay 1, discard it, search your library for a swamp, and put it into your hand. This 6/5 is pretty tough to block, and it can alter combat even in the really late stages of a game, and if you draw it early and need a land, it can fetch one for you, giving it a C. Next up, it's Urikhai Berserker, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/2 Orc Berserker at common. When it enters the battlefield, the ring tempts you. These are below rate stats these days, and if this didn't do anything else, it would be like a D-, even with a useful creature type. Getting tempted by the ring is real upside, though, and you can sort of look at it as adding some words to the text box of the Urikhai Berserker, but if it's the first time you've been tempted, it's really not going to be that good. And even the second time isn't going to make this that impressive of a card overall. It's probably just a C-. Next up, it's Voracious Fellbeast, which for 4 generic and 2 black is a 4/4 Drake Beast at uncommon. It's got flying. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a creature, and you create a food token for each creature sacrificed this way. This is a reasonably sized flyer that subtracts from the opponent's board and gives you food, and that's a pretty attractive package. If it only gave you the food or was only an edict effect, it would be playable, though not that good. So getting both is pretty nice. Of course, edicts do tend to get worse by the time you cast your 6-drop because your opponent is more likely to have something that is very expendable on their side of the battlefield. But still, I think this looks like a pretty good 6-drop overall. I'm giving it a C+. And our last card is an impressive one. It's Witch King of Ingmar, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 5/3 legendary Wraith Noble at Mythic Rare. It's got flying. Whenever 1 or more creatures deals combat damage to you, each opponent sacrifices a creature that dealt combat damage to you this turn. The ring tempts you, and you can discard a card and it gains indestructible until end of turn, and you tap it. This might be the biggest bomb in the set. It has pretty good stats for a 5-mana flyer. Take away the rest of the text box, this would still be a card you basically always would play, but then it's got a doozy of a text box. It's difficult to kill thanks to its ability to become indestructible, and keep in mind I see this mistake a lot on this sort of indestructible ability. You don't have to tap it as part of the cost, so it can be attacking, you can discard a card and make it indestructible. Tapping it as part of the effect, that's sort of meant to weaken it a little bit, so if your opponent has removal and uses it on their turn and you discard a card and to make the Witch King indestructible, then your opponent can attack because you have your Witch King tapped. That's the only reason it says tap it, not because it's a cost. So now I think we'd already be talking about a card that is a bomb, a hard-to-kill 5-mana 5/3 flyer that can end the game in a hurry in the air, but then it also harshly punishes your opponent for ever choosing to attack you because you get the ring to tempt you, which can upgrade something on your board, of course, and they have to sacrifice one of the creatures that dealt damage to you. This can really be a problem too if your opponent is attacking you and you only let one thing through and make them sacrifice the one thing. There's all sorts of havoc that this card will wreak on the game. As long as you have a card in your hand when you play this and you get to untap, it's very difficult for you to lose. And I think that makes it an absolutely insane bomb and an A+. So, those are all the black cards in Lord of the Rings, Tales of Middle-earth. I'll be back tomorrow with a look at all the red cards. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to catch up on the rest of the review, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. And if you want to catch the future videos in this review and other content, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.